Extreme peer pressure, life-lasting student loans, and begrudgingly long essays and reports, college life in the modern world can cause high stress, force you to endure an anxiety-ridden environment, and is often nothing like Hollywood likes to portray it. Considering all of that, modern European universities may seem a lot better option than American universities. But back in medieval times, every day could have been the last day in a prestigious university such as Oxford. Welcome to Nutty History, and today we're looking back at the bloody history of the town of Oxford and why you wouldn't survive in this medieval city. 14th century Europe was deadly. Even before we can come to the point of why was the little academic town of Oxford quite deadly to survive in, the whole of Europe wasn't doing quite well at the survival rate, if we're being honest here. The Mongol invasion from the east, the collapse of the established socio-economic structure, a series of famines, and of course the major highlight, or the dark shadow of the 14th century, was the Black Death, which nearly wiped out half of the human population in Europe. So from the very onset, your chance of surviving 14th century Europe was less than 1 in 2. To make it worse, the church was the prime lawmaking organization in England back then and enforced tithes, a tax of 10% on all peasants, which could break the back of poor families during hard times. Thanks to the church's influence, diseases and ailments were still considered divine wrath rather than biological abnormalities and imbalances. Medicine as a science was making steady progress for a couple of centuries, but was way behind given how things were rapidly progressing in the Middle East. Lack of preservation would make crops become infested with psychedelic fungi and bacteria, and the drinkable water was a luxury. There was no proper sewage system, and the River Thames reeked badly. In fact, according to many Europeans themselves, England was one of the worst places to live in Europe itself for its lack of proper infrastructure, constant wars and infighting, plus the infant mortality rate was abysmal. Yet somehow, due to sheer human will, England's population was on the rise and saw it reach the magic figure of 5 million by the year 1400 because, despite their preservation problem, agriculture in England was booming thanks to the recently introduced crop rotation technique. More crops meant farming became a more lucrative profession, and more farmers meant a need for more farmland. As a result, England saw a rise in a number of villages and towns. Now, some of these towns evolved into more than just farming settlements, such as Cambridge and Oxford. Oxford was already a hub of learning since Henry II banned English students from attending the University of Paris in the mid-12th century. But thanks to the efforts of William of Durham, the university came into its own in the mid-13th century. As the church was still the big brother of England and mostly all of Europe, universities were pretty much the center for learning theology only, with some lessons in medicine, astronomy, and logic. But you could not study there with aspirations of becoming a qualified doctor, engineer, or even an accountant. Being enthusiastic about such vocations may lead you to be strung on a stake and be accused of witchcraft. If you toed the line and proved yourself an obedient student, your chances of survival weren't still that great. With no police department and most of your classmates being spoiled brats born of noble blood with political influence, life at Oxford University could be as lawless and much shorter than in the video game Grand Theft Auto. Life and crimes at Oxford University. When it comes to the academic side of medieval universities, they weren't much different from their modern iterations. The goal was to prepare the future generation of young minds for a successful career. The only exception is that unlike modern times, where most students have plenty of options from a greedy exploitive corporation to another greedy exploitive corporation, the pupils of the 14th century were all aiming for a single employer, the church. The social aspect of medieval times in European universities was, however, a total different ballpark. First of all, there were no female students, but that doesn't mean the students were 100% frat boys. The University of Oxford had a strict regulation, or regulations, against gambling, dressing flamboyantly, staying beyond curfew, or seeking contact with women outside the premises of the university. They were supposed to be good boys. Man, who are we kidding? These students were between 14 and 21. They were full of hormones, their first time away from the conventional and moralistic families that had a reputation to uphold, and were surrounded by taverns filled with booze and buzzing with loose women around them. This was a time long before any police force was invented, and the law was more of a set of guidelines. As a result, things were worse than professors feeling frustrated over students coming in late in their classes with a hangover. The chronicles of 14th century Oxford are rife with accounts of pub brawls, riots, muggings, larceny, and even the most heinous crime, forcing someone's demise. Based on investigations led by modern archaeologists and the records kept by medieval coroners, The estimated rate of mortality-related crimes was about 4 to 5 times higher than the concurred Cambridge or even London, which had 40,000 people living there at the time when Oxford's population was less than 5,000. Out of every 4 perpetrators, 3 belonged to the clericus faction. Clericus, or clerics in minor order, was the lowest rank of churchmen and was bestowed upon all students. There were 68 death crimes recorded between 1342 and 1348 in Oxford, and data for the rest of the years wasn't either kept or has been lost to time. These numbers are 20 times higher than statistics for the present day. Interestingly, 72% of victims of these crimes were also students at Oxford. The clericus bit is important here because if found guilty, the students convicted of the crime of unliving someone could plead benefit of clergy to save their skin from their demise under the common law, a convenient loophole. Liberty to strike. An early 14th century letter from a father to his student son, for instance, advised him to keep a long, heavy stick like a sword in his room, with which to exercise so as not to gain the proverbial freshman 15. That letter somewhat gives the idea that there was a weapon regulation in place, but the reality was a stark contrast. Knives were pretty much omnipresent in medieval England, and Oxford was no exception. Thwidle or whittle was the most popular kind of dagger in 14th century Oxford, and only cost a penny, and was sold on the pretense of being the butter knife or cutlery knife. The second most commonly found weapon were axes, which were just about everywhere for cutting wood, and axes were carried by almost all grown men. It was also common among noble students to carry a sword by their hip as a status symbol, and about 12% of deaths caused by assaults were carried out by swords. Though there was no organized police force, the government officials with ranks of bailiffs, constables, sergeants, and sheriffs still existed, and even they weren't safe. Richard Overhy, a preserver of the King's Peace, was brutally attacked by 4 Oxford students with swords, bucklers, and other arms during a summer's night in 1324 and found dead in his home. Trade in textile had made Oxford a bustling medieval town, and the growing number of students just added fuel to the fire. These students often arrived with a lot of prejudice, and as Oxford was sort of a melting pot of culture and diversity, tensions often arose due to ethnic and territorial issues. Not only did the English often fight with the Irish and Welsh, but it was also common to see Northerners and Southern English gangs against each other as well. Another major reason for the scuffle between town and gown, as well as among students themselves, were streetwalkers and town women. The teenagers, often drunk on easily available ale that was being sold often on every corner of Oxford, would get handsy with women, and this would either put them against townsfolk or they might be jumped by their own classmates out of jealousy. A certain student named David was lucky enough to score a date with Christina Worcester and took her to one of the schools in the university after the feast of St. Nicholas on a Sunday. Unknown to him, a group of students were envious of him for being with Christina, and they jumped him. He succumbed to his wounds after suffering for nearly a week. Brawls between people of the same profession were also common, like glove makers who often took their gloves off to have a bout with each other, and hatters who hated each other as well. In the year 1300, an Irish scholar punctured a shoemaker under Oxford's northern gate and fled. The shoemaker didn't survive this horrendous act. Such crimes were often common against foreign artisans from Flanders and the Netherlands. Because they weren't citizens of the city, crimes against them were hardly recorded, and thus many unfortunate deaths didn't even make it to the coroner's record, and the mortality rate could have been way higher than we know or expect. Trials and tribulations. No inspectors or detectives were working for the authorities back then. The responsibility of investigating the crime scene would fall upon the coroners. If the crime had taken place inside the university, often the staff of the university would form a jury. Otherwise, a local bailiff would form a jury of esteemed citizens of the town. Their task was to establish a course of events by hearing witnesses, assessing any evidence, and then naming a suspect. These indictments were summarized by the coroner's scribe. But in special cases where crime often pit the university against the town, the king would send special judges, as was the case of the St. Scholastica's Day riot that happened on February 10, 1355. When 2 students from the university caused a ruckus in the Swindle Stock Tavern about the quality of wine that was being served there. The argument with the taverner saw customers splitting and joining both sides, and soon the argument became a quarrel. The quarrel became a tavern brawl, and the tavern brawl then escalated to a full-fledged riot. The violence continued for 3 days, and armed gangs joined the townspeople in raiding university halls and students' accommodations. A lot of people in the university passed away. The total life-ending tally at the end of the madness was 30 townsfolk and 63 university students and staff. In case of a trial needing judges from London, the accused could end up spending up to a half a year in prison after arrest, as King's judges would only visit Oxford twice a year. In the first quarter of the 14th century, the King's judges saw 12 out of 29 trials concerned with the death of victims. Now, unless you were rich and born into high-rank nobility, a dark, stinking, rat-infested dungeon would await you. Commoners were sometimes stuffed in really tiny cells built inside the gatehouses and left there to await their trial. In the case of the St. Scholastica's Day Rite, the judges favored the university and fined the town 500 marks, and the mayor and bailiffs of the town were sent to be incarcerated in prison. John Gainwell, the Bishop of Lincoln, imposed an interdict on the town for 1 year, which banned all religious practices, including services on key feast days, burials, and marriages. Only baptisms of young children were allowed. Those who were convicted were either taken to the gallows or thrown back in prison to complete their sentence, which, given the awful conditions in prison, was nearly impossible, and more often than not, the prisoner would succumb to dysentery or fever. If the crime wasn't considered grave enough for prison, or if the convict was high-born enough to not die in prison, they would be banished from the university and the town. For comparison, things were a bit better at the University of Cambridge, where the most prevalent crime was mostly theft, and fatal crimes were much less common. They also had better countermeasures to prevent such incidents, maybe because the university was established by 2 scholars who escaped the University of Oxford after they saw their classmates lynched by the town mob. Things were, however, quite scary on the other side of the pond in Paris. The University of Paris welcomed students from all over Europe, and this diversity often created tension among student factions. The high crime rate in the university also reflected the high crime rate in Paris as a whole. Paris was a large and cosmopolitan city in the 14th century, and it was home to a variety of criminals. The university was not immune to the crime that plagued the city as a whole, yet the popularity of the University of Paris remained high among scholars. If you are wondering why, maybe we will discuss that in a future video. Thanks for watching yet another video on a nutty piece of history, and if you liked it, please do share, like, subscribe, and comment. It helps us grow and make more videos like this for Nutty History.